Morning. So, I was supposed to be in training today, and because of pandemic stuff, they're sending me home to work from home, which is a weird thing. It's been 2 years we've been into this pandemic now, and this is like the first time I'm gonna actually like work from home. I guess that's a little weird for people, because you hear so many like friends and acquaintances that are working from home and have been for like the last couple of years. You hear these stories about people who've been like shut-ins for the last couple of years and just terrified to go outside, which is kind of strange, at least for me, just because what I've been doing pretty much the entire time has been not different. In a hugely substantial way from what I did before, right? I'm still out driving around, interacting with people, taking calls for service, getting really like up close and personal with people, in a way that probably for some now is just like really like frightening. But I'm working from home today to do some training, so I'm driving back home now, which is interesting. That's not really what I planned on talking about today. I guess what was on my mind was just kind of try to articulate my philosophy on policing generally, and some of my thoughts about what it's like now and what it could be like or what it should be like. I don't know. We'll see where this goes. Generally speaking, if you want to get philosophical about it, and I think we should have some kind of solid moral and ethical underpinnings to how society does policing. You think about what the function of law enforcement actually is, and I like to think of it in terms of Steven Pinker's, I think, talked about the honor culture, and then the dignity culture, and then now the grievance culture that we live in, right? And so you think back to like feudal Japan or Europe, and honor culture, any slight to your honor had to be met with like immediate and just violent reprisal, right? Because to do anything but that, you would show weakness to your enemies and then invite more attacks and more problems for yourself. And eventually we got to a point as a society where we said, that this kind of vendetta, the Hatfields and the McCoys sort of thing, the feuds that would go on between close family groups had to end, right? These bloody reprisals that just kind of chronically plagued humanity for thousands of years. And so we said, well, here's what we're going to do. We're going to create the state as an impartial arbiter of, justice, right? So if you have a problem, somebody insults you or infringes on your rights in some way, rather than exercising your kind of inherent human right of meeting that insult with, again, some sort of violent reprisal, you would delegate your right to do that to the impartial arbiter of justice, or the state, and practically that means law enforcement, right? And so in the United States we have the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and things that the state is established and required to enshrine and protect on behalf of the citizens, so that they don't have to then go out and enforce those rights themselves at the barrel of a gun, right? And now we find ourselves in kind of this grievance culture where everything is invested in the state to control outcomes, as opposed to settle grievances, or settle not grievances, but the disagreements between people. It's not really super relevant to policing generally, as far as what the difference between grievance culture and dignity culture. But if we kind of look at it, dignity culture is maybe an ideal we were trying to strive towards at some point, where people had this kind of internalized self-worth that wasn't dependent on either the one extreme, enforcing it at the barrel of the gun, or at the other extreme, the state enforcing the outcome of whether or not you have dignity as a person. Dignity culture it was kind of an emergent property of your own idea of self-worth, and the circumstances for that were created by law enforcement. I mean, not necessarily police specifically, but the state enforcing laws in a just and impartial manner, right? And people want to disagree about whether law enforcement has ever been just or impartial, and certainly it's a human system, and it deals with flawed human beings, and it can be more or less just or impartial. But again, as an ideal, I think that's something worth striving towards. So, as things stand now, if we look at the like defund movement, for example, what we see is the consequences of that social contract and that dignity culture being compromised, right? And people are finding themselves increasingly unwilling to delegate that right to bloody reprisal to the state, because they don't feel the state is an impartial arbiter of justice. And so you have kind of this tension between individuals who want to take matters into their own hands, and individuals who want to not delegate that right to violent reprisal to the state, but to totally divest themselves of rights in favor of total state control. And those are two incompatible worldviews. Practically speaking, what that's looked like is, if you think back to summer 2020 in Portland, and just the entire breakdown of the enforcement of law and order, right? And just isn't to say that every law that's broken needs to be resulting in somebody being handcuffed and lodged in a jail and charged with a crime, or that there isn't a place and a profound need for people to be able to exercise their First Amendment rights, because there is. But when you have a group of people, maybe even a subgroup within a larger group that's trying to peacefully demonstrate, that's hell-bent on engaging in wanton destruction and violence, and then the state abdicates its responsibility to enforce the law when it comes to things like riot and arson, and you have buildings full of people that are being barricaded and deliberately set on fire. And the mayor of Portland, Ted Wheeler, actually said, hey, when you barricade people into a building and then set it on fire, I mean, you're attempting to commit murder. And so we've got mob violence, or attempted mob violence, with these arsons going on for, more than 100 days. I mean, months at a time, right? And then even when the police were allowed to disperse crowds and make arrests, the district attorney didn't, make sure that there was any follow-through or any consequences, right? A lot of these people were released without charge, and then later on, a lot of these people were not ultimately, prosecuted in any meaningful way. And it's been really just kind of a stark difference between how those folks were treated, say, and then the rioters on January 6th, right? And you've got people who are, being held now in solitary confinement for months at a time on, what amounts to primarily like trespassing charges and disorderly conduct charges. and you've got that kind of malicious and capricious punishment on one group versus the other group, which has gotten off almost entirely without significant consequences for, basically trying to attack the edifice of the federal government in a very public and prolonged way for, in a very violent and dangerous way, with wanton disregard for the lives of the people inside those buildings. And so the officers that were tasked with dealing with that on an ongoing basis were hamstrung and unable to respond. And so again, when you have this really kind of uneven enforcement on, roughly analogous events, it calls into question the credibility of that institution and its ability to be that impartial arbiter of justice. And when that happens, you get this kind of breakdown in social cohesion, and I think that's really evident in how violent crimes have spiked across the country the last couple of years. And of course, media is just falling over themselves trying to explain it away as a consequence of COVID or economic factors, and nothing mentioned about how, for example, in Portland they did away with the gun enforcement task force, right? So they have these people who are tasked specifically with intervening and preventing violent crimes from occurring, getting illegal weapons off the streets, and because there was a perception that this was disproportionately impacting certain minority groups, that it had to go away. And of course, it's, I want to be generous and say that the people who advocated for doing away with that task force were concerned about the welfare of the people being impacted, and just the community that is dealing with the results of that decision, are suffering unintended consequences, if we're being charitable of that policy. But whether it's unintended consequence or, just a callous sort of political calculation on the part of people who are trying to accomplish some other political aim and don't really care about, the impact that rises in violent crime have on the community they purported to care about, the result is the same, right? We have communities that were supposed to be helped by this task force being disbanded, now, disproportionately suffering a huge spike in violent crime. And cities all over the country are now setting, at least, local records for, gun violence within, the last 5, 10, 15, 20 years or whatever. And that's awful, right? I mean, these are people's lives. We talk about whose lives matter, and we don't consider the knock-on effects of the policy. We just end up with policies being implemented because they sound good and charitable and kind and empathetic, but nobody questions whether or not it's actually having the desired effect. And on the rare occasion somebody does ask that question, it's like, well, is this accomplishing what we need? We've got this presupposition of bias, institutional racism, that says, well, if more people in this demographic group are suffering, then the policy must be racist. Therefore, we need to do more of what we've already done to try and change it, even if what we've already done has made things worse, not better. And there's no critical self-reflection about whether or not this policy is actually accomplishing what it set out to do. It's just, blame the police, right? people are shooting each other more, well, obviously that's the police's fault too, right? And there's nothing they can do right. And so we undermine their credibility as an institution, and we get into this vicious cycle where they're, further discredited. Therefore, people engage in violent reprisals because they can't trust the state to resolve these issues, and therefore situations degrade. The police are blamed. They're further undermined and undercut and hamstrung, and things spiral out of control. And you end up with, areas of the country becoming increasingly lawless. People talk about Chicago and kind of derisively call it Chirac. The body counts are just atrocious. And it doesn't have to be that way. Clearly it wasn't that way before. And which isn't to say what we were doing before was perfect. But, is it not manifestly better if fewer people are dead? And if something we were doing differently before correlated with lower body count, why can't we look at that disproportionate outcome and take action based on those indicators instead? I don't know. That's what I got for today. If you're listening, tell me what you think. If you find this interesting, if you want me to talk about something else, let me know. It's been fun. See you next time.